Hello, and welcome to the Bite Size Theology Podcast, Extended Edition, Episode 27. Coming to you from three fellas whose top five friends are all different walls in their house.
That's pretty good.
I'm your host, Aaron Lively. Joining me this week is Sage Blaylock.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
And John McCord.
Trying to figure out which wall would be like my biggest friend. Is it bad to say the bathroom wall?
It's the one you spend the most time looking at, you know?
Yeah, probably so.
Maybe.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. I was joking around with somebody earlier where it's like, you know, if I had to rank my top five wall friendships, I would do it on my MySpace page so that all the walls that are numbered 2 through 5 can look at my MySpace and then be sad that they're not better friends. You know, it's kind of like it's like a passive aggressive way of telling them to do a better job being my friend, if that makes any sense.
So who are you talking with about this?
A coworker. It's coworkers, okay? They're the only people I interact with anymore.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Was it one of the walls?
Yeah. How did you know that?
If it was, that's okay.
It was.
All right.
I work with walls. I talk to walls.
That's what this podcast is about, folks. This podcast is about the truth.
It really, really is. I'm glad we could get to the bottom of that. So how's quarantining treating you guys? Scale of 1 to 10. You have to give a firm score and explain it.
I'm starting to get cabin fever a little bit. I'm not even gonna lie. You know, you just start going a little crazy. You know, It's like, how many times can I walk to the kitchen and not get anything? Like that's where I am. It's my favorite game now.
Yeah. So you didn't give a number.
Yeah, I was going to say that we do numbers here, John.
Pretty shoddy explanation of your quarantine experience.
Okay. Well, so it was a 10 out of 10 because my wife was working remotely and I was working remotely. She's no longer working remotely, so I'm left to sit with myself. And that is my worst nightmare.
Yikes.
Yeah. So now it's like a 2, I would say, because I have made myself laugh a couple of times by myself like a crazy person.
You sure it wasn't the walls making you laugh?
No, I think I have slightly a better personality than most of the walls in my house. Not all.
That's hard to believe. How about you, Sage?
I mean, I'm still holding strong at like probably an 8.75. Like,
What?
Very specific.
I'm doing well. You know how I do with these number lists. Like, I'm always going to do that. I'm always going to hit you with a 7.666 repeat. You know, like I'm going to do that. Like
You operate on like an 1,000-point scale over
there. Exactly. Well, if you think about it, numbers are virtually infinite. So, I mean, I could push this as far as I wanted. But yeah, 8.75. 3.8, you know, like it's been good. Like I'm doing fine. I'm introverted, so you know, have like not having to see people can sometimes be a positive. But I'm with Jamie all the time, which is great. We have started walking more. This has, you know, been an opportunity for us to basically only have walking as a thing we can do. So yeah, I'm doing good.
All right. I kind of view my quarantine experience sort of like a steady decline into insanity. So like, I don't know. At the beginning, I was like really bothered by all of this stuff because I was like, this just isn't right. Like, this is terrible. I need to be out socializing and stuff. And now I feel like time's passing faster than usual. As you can tell, I'm talking to all the walls in my room and making good friends with them. And it's getting bad, dude. I think by the end of this, I won't even be able to be around other people. It'll be too dangerous for the other people.
You're going to be just throwing axes into doors and yelling, here's Johnny.
flashing people's trampolines. Yeah. That's what real criminals like us do. All right. Maybe it's best that we segue. Wow. If you love conversations like that, might I begin to tell you about our Patreon page? So we have a Patreon. It's bite size. It's not that. Sorry. It's patreon.com/bite-size theology. Wow, this is going really well. So if you like anything that we're doing somehow, and you listen to this and you're not completely turned off the minute you boot up this podcast, well, I'm impressed, first of all. But second of all,
thanks, Mom.
We yes, Sage's mom and all of our families who, that's about all the people who could.
Not all of our families, most of them.
No, that's fair. Anyways, wow, we're getting sidetracked here. Patreon.com/bite-size theology. Feel free to throw us $1 a month and support what we're doing here. And again, no pressure. You're totally welcome to do that if you feel like you enjoy this content and want to help support us continuing to do that. And if not, that's totally cool too. And anyway, that's my Patreon plug for the episode. Throwing it right up in the beginning. Yeah. And then, I mean, that's what you got to do, right?
Definitely.
That's right.
So now it is time for our opening segment. And you guys, we have a really special one available for you all today. This opening segment is called Straight into the Main Topic.
Whoa, what do we do in this opening segment?
In this opening segment, John, we go straight into the main topic.
Wait, so how do we keep score?
You keep score by, it's a 0 to 1 scale, and you get 1 point for continuing on to the main topic.
We haven't been doing a good job of that right now, so I think we got a 0.
All of our past episodes have been a 0, and the current episode we're getting a 0 too.
What do we do in the event of a tie?
A committee will review it, but on a different episode.
Okay.
Because we have to get straight into the main topic.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. I'm with you.
Yeah. So I don't know. I feel like this topic that we're doing today, and we're actually going to be doing a little bit of it in the next couple episodes, is something that, it's not exactly something we'd planned on doing. At least for me, in a situation where I'm in now, and we'll tell you a bit more about in this episode, it feels more like it's kind of out of necessity. But I'll kind of pass it over to John, and he'll give a little bit of a background as far as what we want to do with these next 3 episodes, because they'll be a little bit more serious than usual, a little bit heavier, and a little bit more personal. So, John, feel free to school us in the art of seriousness.
Yeah. So this series is going to be on deconstruction. Now, I don't know if anybody has seen like the YouTube videos that are going around lately. I know that I think Rhett and Link did a deconstruction video, and I know like the band Gunger did a deconstruction video a while ago. And these videos are usually about losing your faith, right? Which is not encouraging and not really a thing that makes the most sense for us to talk about. However, we on this podcast talk all the time about how the church should be a place where doubts and questions are welcome. So we are going to do a deconstruction series and really kind of get vulnerable, letting people into conversations that we're definitely uncomfortable letting people in. Like we 3 have been friends for a long time. And usually when somebody has a problem, you do what friends do and you talk with one another and you kind of keep it private. But when it comes to some conversations about faith, I mean, at some point we got to put our money where our mouth is. And I think we all 3 are a little uncomfortable because we are not the kind of people with a lot of selfies on our social media. Like we are not about people kind of in our business for publicity or whatever. But at some point, if you keep saying that questions are welcome, you keep saying we want to be vulnerable, you got to be, right? So this series, we're going to be talking about kind of deconstruction of our own faith. We're going to be going through our own faith, because deconstruction can either be an extremely negative thing or an extremely positive thing, because you're kind of breaking down what you know to be true and seeing if there's any falsity in there. And so today, Aaron's going to be talking about kind of the process he has been in, which is probably the most serious of us three, with doubts and questions and fears. So really, he's going to be talking about deconstruction through questioning. And then over the next 2 weeks, Sage and I will kind of tell our own story. Sage through deconstruction, through education, both in college as a philosophy major and then in divinity school. And then for me, deconstruction through my first 2 years of full-time ministry and all of the, I don't even really know how to put it into words, like all the hurt, all the good, all the thoughts that I had in my head that I was convinced were true, falling apart and being not true. So it's going to be a serious 3 weeks. And it's going to be pretty uncomfortable, and it's going to be real. But I mean, I think a lot of us probably are sitting at home thinking about things more than we usually do. And probably many of us have these questions about our own faith. So we hope that in our conversation that we might be able to help a little bit. But we're going to start off with a quote of the week from, of course, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, because who else would it be if I get to pick the quote of the week? And it comes from his book, The Cost of Discipleship. And he says, the real trouble is that the pure word of Jesus has been overlaid with so much human ballast, burdensome rules and regulations, false hopes and consolations, that it has become extremely difficult to make a genuine decision for Christ. Of course, it is our aim to preach Christ and Christ alone. But when all is said and done, it is not the fault of our critics that they find our preaching so hard to understand, so overburdened with ideas and expressions which are hopelessly out of touch with the mental climate in which they live. It's just not true that every word of criticism directed against contemporary preaching is deliberate rejection of Christ and proceeds from the spirit of the Antichrist. So many people come to church with a genuine desire to hear what we have to say, yet they are always going back home with the uncomfortable feeling that we are making it too difficult for them to come to Jesus. That was written in like 1930s, and it's still just as true today. And so we're going to talk about honest faith here. We're going to talk about breaking down some of our stuff, breaking down what we think we know to be true, and talk about our struggles pretty openly. And this is not trying to discourage anybody by any stretch of the imagination. This is just trying to be honest and vulnerable and trying to be real about where we're at. And hopefully we all come to the conclusion that, man, it's all about Jesus and everything else can just fall away. But so that's the opening segment. And so it's going to be an interesting 3 weeks for sure. But we're starting off with Aaron today. And so Aaron, we'll kick it over to you, man. Like, what is this? What you've been going through? What's this deconstruction thing meant for you?
Yeah. Before I get started, just you guys are welcome to invite, or you guys, I want to invite you to feel free to ask questions or to interrupt at any point during this, because, you know, it doesn't have to be just me kind of talking and everything. If you have questions about any of this stuff, or, you know, want to clarify some things, that's, you know, totally up to you guys, and want to make sure to encourage that. And, you know, this is a discussion. It's me telling my story and everything, and kind of sharing some uncomfortable stuff, but feel free to ask questions. So I don't know. I feel really anxious about talking about this, because for me, in a lot of ways, I'm having a hard time still putting voice to a lot of how I feel, I feel anxious because, this is a developing story. It's not something that I have all of this stuff figured out, or I've come out the other end of it and I'm like looking back on it and saying, wow, that was hard. Like, this is something that I'm really actively feeling right now. And I'd say it's the most vulnerable thing. This is harder for me to talk about than sharing anything about like anything personal that we've talked about before, as far as like going through a divorce and, sharing some of the other aspects of my story and everything. So this is really difficult. John kind of touched on this a little bit, but a deconstruction, you see that word thrown around. You might have seen it thrown around. You might not know exactly what's involved in that, but it's, a lot of us grow up in the church and we're taught all of these different things about who God is. And some of those things are, consistent with what they're supposed to be trying to teach you. Some of those are consistent with the Bible. Some of those are not. And oftentimes, a lot of people will like miss the entire point and everything. But, it's on top of that, it's just a lot of people will basically come to a point in their lives where they sort of have to ask themselves, like, do I actually believe any of this? And we encourage that on this podcast, right? Is ultimately asking those questions honestly. And we want this to be a space where that's encouraged. But at the same time, deconstruction is really uncomfortable because it feels like it's ripping everything out. It feels like it's taking all of these aspects that you always believed about who God is and what the Bible says and what is the Bible and who is God? What is this God even like? And how can I trust the Bible? And you run into all of these things, and like a lot of people will come out the other end of that. I mean, John, you used the example of Rhett and Link. A lot of people come out the other end of that having sort of lost their faith and come out on the other end of it saying like, well, I don't really know anymore. It's kind of like a hopeful agnostic kind of position, and so, when you go through this deconstruction, right, you feel like these things are, you start to have like these kinds of questions that are challenging, right? I mean, there's like, we can't sugarcoat it. There are really hard questions to wrestle with in Orthodox Christianity. Like we talked about hell, or like why God allows evil and suffering on this podcast. Like those things are all things that are hard, that don't have concrete answers. And sometimes the best thing we can do is just be like, I don't know, and it starts off that's, for me, it kind of started off like, that's okay. Like we're seeking context for these things. We're trying to figure these things out. We're trying to sort through them. And, what was the author's intent? What was the historical background of these things? And I feel like there's a line that you cross eventually where it starts to become scary, because you start thinking of, for me, I think one of the things that I'm wrestling with the most right now, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but it's, how can we trust the Bible as God's word? Why is the Bible inerrant or infallible? And is getting hung up on those words as important as it should be, And I guess for me, that's like one of the biggest concerns and frustrations that I have. And things that, again, I want to just be as clear as I possibly can, that I haven't landed anywhere on any of this. These are all things that I'm feeling and questioning and processing now. And so, I just want to be upfront about that. This is a deconstruction I'm going through right now. And it is really, really uncomfortable, because it feels like you have this stable foundation of theological beliefs that you've taken for granted for your whole life. And suddenly something is said, or you start to think about things in a certain light, or you have a question that's really difficult to tackle, and suddenly it doesn't feel as stable as it was. So my feelings about talking about this change, there are some times where I'm like, this is not as big of a deal as I'm making it out to be. Like this is just another aspect of me like growing closer in my relationship with God. And then there are other times where I'm like, this feels like everything. This feels like I'm throwing everything up in the air, everything that I've ever like held for granted because of some uncomfortable, just a couple uncomfortable questions, you know?
Well, so can I stop you there and ask you a question?
Yeah.
So when you're going through this process, right, it's obviously a very negative process. But if you threw everything up in the air and none of it came back down, is there any way that that could be positive for you? Does that make sense? It's like if you throw all these beliefs up and nothing, like they all go away.
Yeah.
Is there any chance that that could be positive?
That's the challenging question to answer, right? Because I feel like I feel like churches, especially like Protestant churches, they're kind of dug in their trenches in terms of like theological beliefs sometimes, right? Some of them handle it the right way. And it's like, hey, these are, it's okay. You can disagree. You can still be here and stuff like that. But for me, I think the thing that's scary about this experience and feeling like all this stuff is up in the air and not knowing what's going to come back down is, so, I mean, you kind of like look at it as, it almost feels like we've equated certainty with having a strong faith, which I don't know if that makes any sense to you. It almost feels like that's kind of the tension, or where the tension comes from, because for me, it's hard to figure out what the line is between, this is something cultural that I've always been told. This is just an aspect of the church that I grew up in that, is something that I've always been told, versus like, this is something that's core to the Bible, or like or what I've always been taught about the Bible. And this is key to its inerrancy or infallibility, or what does it look like to throw those things away? And what does that even mean?
Right.
And I feel like for me, we always talk about, like, it feels like there's this pressure to stay within the bounds of Orthodox Christianity that makes it more of a fearful experience. Like, you see the social rejection people go through in the church from asking questions like that, like starting to doubt the existence of hell, or starting to ask questions about, is the Bible really inerrant? Like, is it God's word, the one true God, or is this how God has revealed himself to a particular group of people in a cultural place? And we can still believe, like, totally there's some supernatural involvement in how it came together, but like, is there something deep fundamentally wrong with saying how do we know it's inerrant or infallible? So that's, for me, I don't know if that kind of answers your question, John, but I don't know. For me, yeah, I don't know. For me, I guess those are the things that like hit me at the core of my heart whenever I start worrying about what talking about this is going to be like.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So for me, I guess the deconstruct. So I don't know. For me, I've always been an empathetic person in terms of like, I feel like I can understand people's perspectives, but I think that the fault in that is that I can listen to somebody's perspective and listen to what they believe, and understand what they feel about those things so much that I almost feel like I need to validate their opinions. And I almost feel in some way like those opinions become my own, which again is it's probably not the best thing, right? Because for me, so for example, John, you brought up Rhett and Link, right? These are YouTube comedians that I have never followed in my entire life, right? People that I'd never been exposed to, never really followed that much. And they came out with, basically, they do a podcast of their own. It's called Ear Biscuits. And they basically they basically started off by saying, like, there is a part of our lives, like, we've been doing this for years, this YouTube stuff for years, and there's a part of our lives that we really have never talked about until now. And they were missionaries with crew, which kind of crazy, but it's like out of nowhere, you're suddenly listening to people who who went through a similar experience, asked all the same questions, and they had all the theological arguments. You know, it's not like you're listening to somebody. I guess that's the thing that I would always do listening to somebody's deconstruction story is it's like, well, maybe their theology is like not good enough, or they just don't know the apologetics arguments for this. It's like, I can explain to you why hell exists, or why, why evil things happen, or why the Bible is infallible or inerrant, and what actually that means or could mean. You know, I can spit all those things out whenever you want me to, but it's a completely different thing to listen to a couple of people kind of break down their story and have all of that, like all of those exact arguments prepared before you are able to even process through those things, you know? And that's the thing too, is it's like their attempt was not to like shoot anybody down. It was also a very open and transparent story on their part. And it's funny. I mean, it's just weird because like you've got all these similarities that weren't even just in terms of the questions that I started asking, but it was also in terms of like their early childhood and like, you know, growing up in the church and getting started in the church, like doing dumb videos with their friends for the youth group, like stuff like that, stuff that I did, you know, with you guys to some extent, and, you know, with you, John, in high school and all that stuff. And to me, that even that stuff started hitting me pretty tough. And I guess, I don't know. Sorry, go ahead, John. I think
Yeah,
you're about
well,
to say
I just kind of want to stop. I want to ask a question on that because
Sure.
I had a buddy of mine send me this, and it's from a book, and I don't know a book. So if you wrote this book while you're listening to our podcast, you're way smarter than us. It says, we cannot have a relationship with our Christology. We can have a relationship with Jesus Christ. Our soteriology cannot save us from our sins. Our Savior can. Our ecclesiology does not make us one with the Lord of the church does. Our eschatology will not transform this flawed universe. Jesus, the King of Kings and Prince of Peace, will do that. And no matter how much we love theology, it will never love us back. Only God in Christ loves us. And that's why believing is a relationship.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what you think of that quote.
I think so, man, I don't know. I mean, I think that quote tells me a lot, or I think it allows me to sort of trace my own story back a little bit, right? Because this all, I mean, I didn't arrive here out of a vacuum or just completely out of nowhere, right?
Right.
Like I did sit down relatively recently and sort of trace back, like, why am I feeling this stuff now? And I guess what's the trajectory of my faith, and how has that sort of led me to here? And I think that particular quote, or at least the thing that it's trying to get across, right, that ultimately faith is about a relationship, right? It's about a relationship rather than a list of do's and don'ts or a list of bullet pointed things, you know? I think that's all realization that I had back when I was going through the divorce, you know? Cause I even I trace it back, you know, it's like, I'd say the first time that I ever started, cause you grow up in church, right? And it seems, for me at least, it was always like, you guys know this part of the story, but like, you start to see things that are going on in the church that like aren't super savory, and you start asking questions about why those things are happening. And it's like, does this actually like make any sense with what I've always been taught? And like, turns out like a lot of times when I've been, you know, sort of confronted with that reality, it's always been additive. I guess that's the difference between where I'm at now and where I've always been at, in terms of like, I have this like life-changing experience that teaches me a lot about who God is in a way that I didn't understand before, right? Like high school had all this legalism, had this rosy-eyed vision of what the church was. And, you know, 2014, going on mission trips to Kenya and Costa Rica and coming back to the American church and to a campus ministry, and seeing all of those preconceptions shatter, those were good, right? Like it felt like those things hurt in some ways, but I also, and you know, this could totally be the same situation, right? I could look back a year from now and say, I'm really glad I went through this. But in retrospect, it almost doesn't feel like any of those situations were quite like this, because it almost felt like all of that stuff is just enriching my understanding of things that I'd always been taught, like, I guess it's like, okay, I guess, I don't know. So it's like those things sort of teach me that like my theology is less important than my relationship with Jesus. Right.
Right.
And over time that's become more and more clear, but still kind of steeped in my own world and stuff. And sort of, in terms of like our marriage, like, like kind of viewing everything as like, okay, well, always been raised like, marriage is complementarian, or like, you got all these like preconceived notions about like, oh, well, if things aren't going well, maybe praying, reading our Bible, all that stuff, sort of beating ourselves up with the obedience part of it. Like that was kind of how we approached problems in our marriage. And to see the kind of toll that sort of thing took over time, and also to kind of see, to come out the other end of that, and like to be going through all of that pain and hardship and stuff, for me, it was like the times where I really actually it felt like I started to understand my theology a little bit more, was during those moments where, middle of the night, I'm having a hard time, and I walk outside my house and walk around the neighborhood totally silent, nobody's around, for 3 hours, just venting to God, talking to God, trying to talk to him through that, and having him sort of fill that space. I always felt like those were times where I felt like my relationship with Jesus was growing in a way that was unlike anything I'd ever felt, because it was in those moments that like completely not feeling like I had nothing, and walking through the neighborhood and stuff, and having those conversations where I felt, I felt like I could look at my circumstances and say like, you know what, it's going to be okay, and I also noticed passages started jumping out at me in regards to like Jesus's, it seemed like his focus on people's hearts rather than their behaviors. You know what I mean? I started like the passage about the rich young ruler really hit me in a different way going through the divorce and stuff than it ever had before. Cause it's like, yeah. Like his loves are misordered. He loves money more than he loves God, whatever, but then like, I don't know. It's like, he basically asked Jesus, like, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And you notice like elsewhere in the Gospels, Jesus summarized the Old Testament law in terms of love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And, in that context, the rich young ruler story, like, it makes a little bit of sense. It like makes sense in a way that it didn't to me before, where it's like Jesus is seeing right through to this person's heart and sees what they care about most and sees what they value more than anything. And what he's speaking out against is that. And he's also saying like, I'm supposed to fill that space, And so I guess this is a long-winded answer, John, but I think that quote is sort of what I'd started. It's the type of thing that I've been like slowly starting to grapple with and understand more and more throughout the course of my life, where like God desires our trust more than he desires our obedience, or he desires our love more than he desires our obedience and checking boxes off a list, because he's here for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, so the weird thing is like, I was going through all this, I was plugged in with a church in Colorado that, it's not like they were this, super liberal church. They were a PCA church. They were a Presbyterian church. But I think one of the things that really drew me to them, even as there were some aspects of my theology, like yeah, I guess like in terms of like hell and stuff like that, that stuff was becoming harder to digest in the background, but it wasn't something I was really thinking about because I was in an environment where, number one, like they would encourage or they had an anonymous Q&A as part of every service. So it's like, it's not like they were avoiding questions. It didn't seem like, people were invited to come there and wrestle with questions, which I think is what the church should be, right? It's kind of our philosophy behind the podcast too. And so yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that also was encouraging is it's like there were people there who also had a lot of questions and weren't super sure about a lot of things, and were even on the verges of like not even coming to a church anymore, who were coming to that church because of the fact that they could ask questions. And the church had its beliefs and everything, and that's good. But it's like, yeah, I guess they were more open to questions than you see a lot of churches being. And that was one of the things that really kept me there and kept me encouraged. And there was also a lot of great people we met through that church, So fast forward to when I moved to Johnson City. For me, it was almost like, okay, that church that I was at in Colorado was in Boulder, Colorado. Like, this is not a place that it's a place that's open to spiritual ideas, but it's not a place where there's any, cultural obligation to be a Christian. And there's even sort of a negative stigma in some cases with being a Christian. And they would never ever shy. No one on staff, and I know this because went to groups and stuff like that. No one on staff would ever shy away from a question like, why do you think hell exists? Like, none of them would. And I think one of the things that in some cases, again, it's not a fault of the church. They would totally have been, again, open to answering those questions, but it's just like, it just felt like those uncomfortable things felt more on the back burner whenever like a sermon was being delivered. It felt like we want to talk more about how Jesus doesn't just reform your like joy in life, but like like even in like your work and the things that you do, and you're serving Jesus is like righting things that were broken by the fall or broken by sin. And it's a holistic picture of what the gospel is, where it's essentially not only reduced to substitutionary atonement, but it's the restoration of everything that we touch, or rather everything that Jesus touches, So I guess for me, it was like all of that stuff was awesome. And the thing that was tough, though, was when I moved back to Johnson City, and literally the first church that I went to, there was an accident that happened during the worship service. And someone who had gone to the church for a while but wasn't really going anymore, they had gotten injured in a car accident and they weren't doing so well. And the person who's preaching, on finding all that stuff out, yeah, we prayed for recovery and for him and like for his family and stuff, but it felt so much further weighted on, he's not a believer, and if he dies now, he's going to suffer forever. So that was a moment where that felt more upfront and uncomfortable. That doctrine that like I said, like I know all the apologetics arguments. I've written episodes for this podcast going into those. And like I know why, I know all the reasons for like all the reasons you're supposed to have for like God's justice and stuff like that. But that was the first moment where that didn't just feel hard to swallow. It almost felt wrong. And I don't know, like that was the first time it struck my heart. Like, cause I started thinking back, it's like, is this the God that I fell in love with in Colorado? Like, you're telling me that if someone were born into a religious community that is anything other than ours, they grow up in any other culture, any other society where Jesus is not talked about, and they don't come to this conclusion and this bullet pointed list of who Jesus is, that God is going to, I mean, ultimately they've chosen hell and they're going to suffer forever for that. I mean, honestly, like these are things like that obviously, like I've had moments in my walk with Christ where like those things felt uncomfortable to swallow, you know, those things felt hard to come to grips with before. But this was the first moment where it's like, there's something that like doesn't square with what I've been telling people about who Jesus is and what Jesus wants of people, and like the amount of time he spent with people who seemed the furthest away from religious communities. You've got like prostitutes, tax collectors, all these people who were socially rejected that the religious community didn't want anything to do with. And he's like spending all this time with them and investing in them. And like, this is what God is like. And I don't know, like, I guess for me, that was really tough because it's like, I have answers for all these things, you know, like I get it, you know, I get it. I know what the answers are that I'm supposed to have. And it's the first time where it's felt jarring in a way that feels unjust. And I can, you know, I guess for me, it's like, I trace, it's like you want to start with, I don't know. I guess like for me, that's kind of where the discomfort started. I was already having those kinds of questions, but for me, whenever I would have those kinds of questions, I would either try and suffocate them and not try and think about it too much, or I would run to like a Christian expert, you know, like somebody who's way smarter than me, who can explain it in a way that makes a whole lot of sense. A Tim Keller or a Tim Mackey or a Ravi Zacharias who has the answers, you know. And I think it felt disingenuous to me that here I am saying as many people as I possibly can, ask questions that's going to lead you to the truth, and realizing that I never had.
Yeah. So, I mean, that actually reminds me of something I saw recently. So I watched this video series, and I think it's like called, like the Elephant Room or something like that. This is from probably like 10 years ago or so. There was this like, these famous high profile pastors would have debates about certain issues or conversations in the church. And there was one that struck me as a little odd with the title. And it was something along the lines of like, what do we do with missions? Do we save souls or like meet people's needs? And that seemed like a totally absurd dichotomy to me. And David Platt was on the side of, I guess he was the liberal on the panel of being the person who's like, we should probably like help people with things that are wrong in their lives. Like we should probably help people learn how to build wells.
What a novel concept.
Yeah. we should bring doctors with us and stuff. And like some of the other pastors who have since been, you know, culturally defrocked for things they've done in the church, we're more on the side of like, no, the only thing we need to do at all is bring the gospel. But like that, you're right in that feels so wrong. And I think David Platt said something that I just found to be beautiful, which was like, we care about people here now, not just, you know, in the future. And I think that's something I've tried to talk about on episodes I've done for the bite size episodes. And I've talked about that some in the extended edition of like we are given here and now to enjoy this life where we can, to enjoy the company of others, to enjoy fellowship. And we are given resources with which to do something with. Resources exist to be used for someone. And the fact that we have resources means that we need to find someone that needs them. So he just made this excellent point. Like, we do this as an overflow of the love that Jesus has given to us. So, in terms of missions, we bring the gospel of Jesus, but we also bring food and water, like, because people need food and water. So, that's something I felt too when we have when I have conversations with people about relatives who are in poor health, or a recent passing in my family of somebody who, a cousin of mine who was like a brother to me growing up, who I hadn't seen in a long time, but as close as a brother, an actual literal brother, as I've ever had is this guy. And he recently died. He went into, form of diabetic shock and ended up dying. And that was part of the conversation that was had when we were talking about, while he's in a coma, like, yes, the fear of not a believer, what's going to happen, if he dies not being a believer. But yeah, I do think if we're only concerned with that, then we're not loving the people around us like we're supposed to be, because we're not genuinely concerned with their current suffering. Because I think you can care about both bringing the gospel and meeting people's needs on earth, you can care about people's eternal destination and their current predicament. And I feel like, of course, it's one of those many things in life, and in living the Christian life specifically, where it feels like we're trying to walk a tightrope that only Jesus can actually do, and we naturally fall to one side or the other. But we have to try. And of course, I think where we're from, down south in the Bible Belt, it's definitely much more likely that that the people we're around, at least, or the pastors that preach in our churches, are going to be more concerned with the eternal destination, whatever that is, and however we want to talk about that, than they are with people's lives right now here. And I think that's a huge failing of the church, for sure, especially where we're at. And and we're not trained to think about that. So that's just something that we have to work through on our own. And like you said, like, there's not a place to have that conversation in most churches. So in Colorado, the pastor probably would have been okay with you if he had prayed that same prayer, if you had gone to him and talked about that. Whereas, this church in Johnson City, who knows how that pastor would have reacted.
Right. Well, and I don't want to, I guess I want to clarify, like, I don't want to make it seem like they didn't care for his immediate needs, because that probably isn't true. They probably did, go and like actually like visit and try and like love him, you know what I mean? So it's like, I don't want to make it seem like it's totally not in that field, but yeah, I almost felt like, I feel like the weight, I don't know. It was, I guess the weight put on the other end felt tough for me to hear.
Can I ask a question though? Because so knowing you really well, one thing that I know is, you talked about 3 events in that, and so far you talked about kind of like seeing the problems in the church in high school, right? Like seeing that the way it's not supposed to be, and that bugging you, right?
Yeah.
You talked about going to Kenya and Costa and then coming back into the campus ministry, like the church, right? That you were most involved in and having those problems.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're talking about now was that idea was communicated to you through a church as well.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is like, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but is this questioning, is this unrest, this righteous unrest with the concepts of separation from God and hell, or is it with the church that communicated it? Is this just another one of that popping back up? Because one thing that I love about you, and one thing that, I mean, because it's no secret that you were a massive, like, if you weren't the number one reason why I ended up becoming a Christian, you were in the top 3. And one thing that was constantly exampled for you, that you exampled to me in college, was it's okay to get pissed off about things that aren't okay.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that you consistently got pissed off about was additives, the additives to the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like in every scenario that, you know, we'd be driving home from a church service or a campus ministry event, and I'd be, you know, MFing everything up and down. Like your constant refrain was like, dude, it's not really supposed to be this way. Like, you know? And so with that, with what you exampled to me and what I know about you, I'm just curious if you're once again ready to take out a sword against the additives,
Mm.
and the additives specifically perpetrated by churches.
Yeah, it's a great question, man. And I don't know. Thanks for saying all that. I just love you. I love you, man.
I really do. I know.
I don't know, because this feels different, because it's almost like, okay, if I am like, so like we always want to look at the Bible in its context. You know, we always want to, you know, make sure that we hold the Bible up against, look, like, what was the author's intent of writing it? What was the cultural context? Why was this included? You know? And for me, when it's like, this felt different in the sense that if this is striking me this way, and yes, I feel frustrated with how the church communicated it, it felt like I was like having a really hard time with the concept itself. And suddenly passages where Jesus like is talking about some kind of justice or punishment, you know, passages in Luke, particularly the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, you know, like all this stuff that like is actually in the Bible, like it is stuff Jesus said. Those things felt for me attacked, and that felt like, okay, how do I make sense of any of this? You know what I mean? Because then you're not only have questions about like, okay, well, the church could have like talked about this a little bit better, but it's also like, this feels like really deeply like hard to digest, in a way that I don't know, like it for me. Okay. So for me, the thing that is the hardest for me about all of this is it points back to the Bible. It's, you know, I can like draw up all the ways that like over the course of my walk with Christ and my involvement in the church and stuff, where like, yeah, there was like missteps on the church's part, and there's righteous like frustration about it. But this almost felt like, great. And like, if that's the case, then what do I really believe about the Bible or what Jesus was saying there? Why does it feel like, I mean, you look at like some of the ways, especially when it comes to Old Testament books, like the ways that those were assembled and how it seems more ramshackle than the words like inerrant or infallible would lead you to believe, you know, that there were revisions over time, that a lot of those books had multiple authors. And the question is like, was it inerrant the first time? Like, did it need a revision? And was the revision also inspired, or was the reviser inspired by God too? And like, I guess for me, those were the things that feeling, and also listening to Rhett and Link's Deconstruction, those things started to come up, and that's what made it more deeply uncomfortable. And that's what makes this feel different. And again, like, I'm just saying all this in terms of like, this is just kind of the things that I've been feeling, and I haven't landed on anything concrete. And I'm just really struggling with these questions a lot more than usual. And the problem, I think part of the problem is that I, you know, getting holed up with family over here and like spending a lot of time with them, it's like I don't allow myself the space to explore those things as much as I should. But the problem is, like, am I going to go into those things seeking an answer? Or am I going to go into those things realizing I might come out the other end with the answer, I don't know? And I guess that's the thing too that's been tough, is like, you know, I've noticed that it felt like a lot of the hard-lined answers that I had, or felt like I had, that are in line with sort of like Protestantism and like the, you know, I guess for me, one of the things that I talked to you or asked you about, John, when we had like sort of preliminary conversations about all this, is it's like, why do we think that the Protestant Reformation was like the peak of how we'll ever understand the Bible? And that anything that deviates from that mindset is something that is wrong. You know what I mean? So like, I guess I noticed like a lot of my answers turning into I don't knows about a lot of different things, you know, not just things that there are educated, reasonable answers for within the Christian community, you know, things like the LGBT community, or the way science works with the Bible, or things like that. I think that you can come up with and formulate solid answers on all those things, you know. But it also felt like the block that causes me the most issues is like inerrancy and infallibility, those two words. And I don't know if that's something that I need to hold on to. I don't know if it's like, I don't know. I guess part of me is like, am I letting go of too much? You know, would I be if I landed on the side of like, I don't know, for that?
Right.
And so I guess there's a tension too, where it's like to have even things that are like on our website, like on our beliefs page, make me like respond with like, I don't know, maybe, you know, like that's really tough.
Right.
And I think you also have like the social fallout of asking those questions in the first place. Like I remember like we were really into Rob Bell for a while, and as soon as he wrote that book Love Wins, it's like everyone was like, oh God, like John Piper tweeted farewell Rob Bell as soon as he like announced that he was making a book on that, you know what I mean? So it's like, wow, all right. Like, was like, those, honestly, like when I read that the first time, I was like, yeah, totally, you tell him.
Yeah.
And now like I look at that and I'm like, was that really necessary? Like I feel like all they're doing and responding to him that way is almost proving their point, or his point, you know?
Yeah.
I used to mock people for arriving at that conclusion, but now I look almost at like a Richard Rohr or a Walter Brueggemann or a, you know, Rob Bell, and I'm like, look, I don't think I'm there yet, but I almost see how you do end up there. And are people in the church going to treat me the same way? And I know that those are like deep anxieties, and it's probably not even the case. I mean, I'm sitting here talking about this with you guys, and there are probably people who listen to this who would believe that that's not the case. But those are things that I convince myself of, I think.
Well, so what would you say, like, would you be able to find any comfort? Because one thing that I think that happens is we always like to have an answer for everything, right?
Mm-hmm. That's my biggest problem. Right. If I could just let go of that, I think I'd be okay. But
I mean, fair enough. So like, then comes the question: if we look very diligently at the Bible, one thing that we'll notice is that all the definitive answers that we've come up with are like in the last 200 years. You know, like this was not written out in a way that's like definitive. So like, for example, Job has every right to question God. You wrote that great episode talking about kind of like the extremism of Job. Like, here is the most righteous man in the world. God is baited into this like test with the devil, right?
Yeah.
And then Job gets destroyed in the most extreme way. His friends react in the most extreme way. He reacts in the most extreme way.
Mm-hmm.
So if there was anybody who ever existed ever who had a right to question God, it was Job.
Mm-hmm.
Then Job questions God. And God responds, I'm sorry, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Like, you must have been there because you're questioning me. Same thing happens in Romans 9, is it? With like the jars of clay, where Paul's walking through the argument of like, so what if you are a vessel stored up for God's wrath? And like he's walking through, and like every point you're sitting there reading along with him. You're like, yeah, that's a great question. Paul's like, well, then you probably ask this. And you're like, yeah, that's a great question. And then he gets to the conclusion, like where he would tell us the answer. And he says, but who are you to ask? And so what if all of this questioning and what if all this searching hit back with the answer, who are you? Mm-hmm. What if you got the same response that Job did? Where would you be? Would you be crushed by that, or would you be set free by that?
I think I'd be honestly set free by it. And I think that's the thing that I don't want to, I don't want this time to be me completely leaning into like, these are my doubts and I'm angry and I'm frustrated by them. Cause it's like, I am. But at the same time, I feel like there's been a couple of things that have been really helpful. One is there's this book called The Sin of Certainty by Peter Enns. And he basically, like, the whole point of the book, I mean, you kind of get it in the title, right? The whole point of the book is like, you have like all of these books of the Bible, Job included, Psalms included, Ecclesiastes included, where you have the authors asking really difficult questions, wrestling with things. You got like Psalm 88 that like has no glimmer of hope in it, that accuses God of, doing all this stuff and driving all of his companions against him, right?
Yeah.
And you got all of this stuff in the Bible where uncertainty is not condemned in any way. And like the example you gave of Job, it's almost like, like one of the last things Job says is, I will question you and you will reveal it to me. And he's basically like saying to God, after God tells him, like, did you put all the stars in the sky? Tell me if you have any understanding. And God essentially says, like, Job is the one who's spoken to me in the right, and Job's friends are the ones who have spoken to me in the wrong, And Job's friends are the ones who are trying to provide explanations. They're the ones who are trying to get to the bottom of, here's this bullet pointed reason of why all this evil stuff happened to you. You know what I mean?
Such a good point. That is such a good point. Yeah.
And Job is the one who says, I still don't get it.
Right.
And I'm still going to ask you questions, and you're still going to reveal it to me. And he leaves it in, like, he repents, right? He says that I'm sorry, but at the same time, he does say, like, I will continue to question you. So it's like God saying that saying that Job is the one who's justified in that situation and not his friends, when Job is the one who hasn't arrived at an answer. That is really empowering for me going through this, because I look at it and it's like these things that I've always been saying, where it's like God doesn't turn away people who have questions. It almost feels like not only does he not turn away people who have questions, like entire books of the Bible are based on people having questions and not arriving at an answer and being frustrated by it.
Well, so you just said too, that's so funny. You said that Job's friends are the ones that had the bullet pointed list. And you exactly said that earlier with, like, you're sitting in the church service and you're like, it's hard for me to believe that we would, if somebody was born away from this faith system and didn't have the bullet pointed list, and it's just the same thing. It's exactly what you're saying, where it's like, we make it all about the bullet pointed list and we become Job's friends in the process, It's just kind of, I don't know. The Sin of Certainty is such a good title,
Yeah.
And so so let me ask one more question and then I promise I'm going to shut up.
Oh no, you're fine.
So one thing that's fascinating to me, and I came across this, it's not a fully formed idea yet, but I had the opportunity to give a sermon the other couple weeks ago, and we talked about Peter walking on the water to Christ. Right, I stole the entire thing from Bonhoeffer, like straight up, just plagiarized it. Like
So
crazy.
Yeah. So proud of you. Nobody's gonna cross-check you. You're good.
Yeah. Well, he's dead, so I figured he wouldn't mind.
Right.
He'd be flattered.
Yeah.
He would. He really would.
Well, so, he talks about how that concept of faith and obedience don't exist unless they both go first, right? Peter can't have faith or obedience until he steps out of the boat. Then he has both, and that's when faith exists.
Mm-hmm.
But the point that was fascinating to me was Jesus's response to Peter after Jesus catches him after he starts to sink. He looks at Peter and he says, "Oh, you have little faith. Why did you doubt?" And I think that's what messes us up about the story, because we always make fun of Peter when Peter's the hero of that story. Peter got out the boat. All the other disciples are sitting on their thumbs, like doing nothing. And then it started to take me down this path of looking through Jesus's teachings where he constantly says, "Oh, you have little faith, of you of little faith, of you of little faith." And that sounds like such an insult. It sounds like such a condemnation until you realize, like, you bring it back to him holding Peter in his arms. And that's the kindest thing that he possibly could have said, because he's looking at him and he says, "Oh, you have little faith. Why did you doubt?" And so Peter has no choice but to take his doubts and put them next to the person of Christ. Right? And if you put your doubts next to the person of Christ, then they want to win. One can't exist, right? And so that's why, like, deconstruction is such a positive word to me. And I know that it oftentimes causes people, it's become like the thing that people say when they lose their faith or walk away from the church. But, like, I don't know. It's that. It's Jesus looking at you and saying, "Oh, you have little faith. Why did you doubt?" And you have to put him up. So, like, so in all this process, this leads to my question. If all this process, how has the person of Christ been affected for you? Like, when you think about Christ, right, which is oftentimes we mess up theology by worshiping theology rather than Christ. We mess up all of our beliefs by believing in our beliefs more than we believe in Christ. I do this all the time, where I worship the Bible more than I worship Christ, rather than using the Bible to inform me how to worship Christ. I'm just like, this leather-bound book in my, like,
yeah.
So in all of this, how has your worship of the person of Christ been affected?
It's a great question. It's, I don't know. For me, it's like Jesus is still one of the most fascinating people in history. Like, all the things that are written about him, he is, like, it's ridiculous. Like, he's incredible. And I find myself still, even as I'm going through this and processing all this, I'm still saying prayers to him. I'm still trying to figure all this stuff out. And for me, it's like, it hasn't touched that too much. And I guess, like, I'm worried about it doing that. I think that's kind of the thing that I'm afraid of. But at the same time, as far as this stuff goes, like, it hasn't touched that part of it too much. And, it's like, no matter where I come down on, like, biblical inerrancy or something like that, it's like, I can still believe in Jesus, and so, like, I guess that's kind of where I'm at. I don't even know if that answers your question. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Or
yeah, I mean, my question, I mean, that's it. It's when we face this process of questioning our beliefs, do we find out that we're questioning our beliefs, or do we find out that we're questioning Christ? Because if we find out that we're not questioning Christ when we are questioning our beliefs, then our beliefs have never been connected to Christ. And so, like, maybe they need to be questioned, because maybe they aren't connected to anything.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah. And I want to figure that out.
Yeah.
I guess that's kind of where I'm at, is just, I'm still in that sort of uncertain space where I'm still hashing through a lot of that. And, I don't know, like, again, I think like it's interesting. I feel like there are two people in my life who are probably pretty well equipped to talk through some of this stuff with me. You know, number one, I met a friend who I met through the church in Colorado who was going through something like this throughout the year that we were in small group and going to, and I was like going through the divorce and all that stuff. And he went through something similar, and it still is in some ways. But I think like he was positioned, he he basically lands in like, I ultimately feel a lot more comfortable about it now than I used to. And it's because I believe in the grace, like the grace of God. I believe that he's covered me. I believe we're good, you know? And he's like, I feel the space and the flexibility to ask these questions of him because I know he's going to listen, you know? So I feel like talking to him has been really helpful because he's asked these same sorts of questions and stuff, and sort of he hasn't come out the other end of it necessarily or landed on anything, but he's at least become more comfortable with the uncertainty, which I feel like is a good place to be, and one that I'm still having a hard time wrapping my mind around how that's even possible. But and then Sage, I think you're uniquely positioned to talk through this, and that's kind of why I do want to get into this a little bit more with you, in the sense that, you know, you have been around a lot of different arguments about a lot of different concepts of who Jesus is, a lot of different philosophical beliefs. And I know you're going to talk a little bit about that on your episode and everything, but yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm looking forward to talking through that a little bit more with you and sort of sorting through all that stuff. I think for me, like, for me, I think I need, as I'm going into this, like, I don't necessarily feel like when I come out the other end that I'm going to have more answers. You know what I mean? I don't feel like I'm going to have as many hard stances. And I feel like, you know, I've noticed that throughout my entire life, you know, in my walk with Christ, is like a lot of the things that I used to really adhere to and say, I'm not letting go of this, I really believe this. Those are things that like I've found like over the years slowly letting go and paring back and things like that. And mostly just coming to like, I don't know answers. Um, and I feel that heading into this direction. And in some ways that's scary, but in other ways it's like the Bible doesn't shy away from uncertainty. God allows space for uncertainty. And then the question too is like, John, you talk about stepping out of the boat, right? What if going through this, I even, I feel like the thing I'm going to come out the other end of this with is being able to say, God asked me to trust him through a lot of hard stuff in my life, through a parents' divorce, through a lot of cynicism with the church, through a divorce, all this practical stuff. What if God also wants me to trust him more than I trust my intellect? You know, what if, even though I can't connect all of the dots and it doesn't always make the most sense to me, and there are some days where it's like, I don't even know if I believe any of this, you know? What if God ultimately just prefers that I just step out of the boat, you know, that I step out of the boat, that I recognize this for what it is, as a trust relationship, you know? And I think, I don't know, I think it just occurred to me, like, we're talking about this on Good Friday, which is a day where Jesus from the cross says, my God, why have you forsaken me? and I don't know, I think like a lot of people want to sugarcoat it, but I really think that is doubt embodied in those words, because Jesus is experience. I mean, if you're, you know, again, this is like sort of like a lot of, you know, Reformed theology terminology and stuff, but like he's going through like this cosmic rejection from the Father, you know, and And in that moment, what else are you going to say? And he went through that. The theory is like he went through that so that no one else had to, you know? And so for me, I can ask those questions knowing that God, or at least really hoping and trying to wrap my mind around the concept that God is there and that he will listen, you know? So I don't know. I guess it's kind of where I'm at. And I didn't want to end that on like a note of like, this is only frustrating. This is only, I don't see any good that can come from this, because even as I'm going through it now, and this is probably one of the hard, I mean, honestly, in some ways, this is harder than any of that practical stuff I've been through, because this is asking me to lay down my self-assurance on things, which is like, you know, for me, one of the hardest things is like saying that I'm wrong about this. And like, I can acknowledge, I feel like I can acknowledge that I'm wrong about some stuff, but there are other things where I really dig myself into the trenches, and I have to ask myself, is this me coming to grips with the fact that I, even in the theological beliefs that I always had thought were right, am still digging my heels into an understanding of who God is and making my faith in that and not in who he really is. So anyways, I talk about this stuff knowing that it's in process. And I hope anybody who's listening to this knows that this is in process. And I think that it's totally natural and totally a temptation to like, you know, like here's some material to read up on, or like to try and fix it, you know? Cause I know I would have done the same thing for people who express a lot of the same feelings. I just ask, I don't know. I guess if there's anything that I hope for, it's just that I hope that you ask those questions too, and that as I'm learning how to do, that you trust that God can handle them, you know, and you trust that it's okay to ask them. And even if your church or your community, like, even if it feels like dangerous to say those things, it's more important to express them, and to not keep those bottled up. Because for me, like, suffocating those questions is the worst thing I can do, because it's for me, it's disingenuous. Like, I've only ever, when I've had doubts, suffocated them. And that's really ironic coming from somebody who writes for this podcast, where we really want to encourage people to ask their questions and to come and have those questions because God's not afraid of them, you know, to find out that really I haven't asked God too many questions, and to find out that really, like, I have never asked any questions of myself. That's really hard. But yeah. Sage, I see you have 1.5 questions that you want to ask.
Yes.
So go for it.
I didn't want to interrupt you, so I just put it in the chat.
No, that's okay. I was pretty much done.
Yeah, so I don't want to give too many spoilers for my own journey before we do, you know, the episode where, you know, I talk a lot about, you know, my phase of deconstruction. But I know, so for me, it often felt like I was like in a river and the current was too strong for me, and I was just being pulled down the river.
That's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, to who knows where. And ultimately, like, there was one branch sticking out into the river that I could grab onto, that I was able to like pull myself back ashore. And, you know, it might be it probably is too early for you to say, like, you know, what that is, if that branch is out there. But what do you imagine could potentially be that thing for you? Or, you know, put another way, like, one thing I had to tell myself every day was like, okay, so if all of this is wrong, if I've been wrong about everything, like, what is the one thing I can fall back on? And it like, there was so much I had to fight through to find that answer for me. I mean, do you have any, guesses? Like, is there something at this moment that's sort of giving you comfort within all of this? Do you think you have anything like that at this moment? Are you still working to find that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, I'm still figuring out what that is. I feel like there's things that I can grab onto, and that feels pretty good. I have you guys, for example, and I know that I can find in you guys a space where I can express all of this stuff, and like it's not something that's taboo enough to say, oh, there's the door, unless you guys want to. I mean,
No.
totally, get me out of here. No, but I think that's comforting. I think it's also, for me, the things that are grounding me are, number one, that book that my friend recommended from Colorado, The Sin of Certainty and stuff. Like, I feel like all that stuff and realizing that my uncertainty is not the end of the world is really good. It's really been helpful. I don't know. Like, I think I'm still trying to figure out like what exactly that branch is, if there is one, where I'm at in the current, how close I am to a waterfall. If there is, I don't know where I'm at, you know what I mean? So I guess that's a really good question, but I think that's at least a start.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so the other question, quote unquote, and I don't really know what to do with this. I don't know if it's a comment or a question. I guess we'll find out when I'm finished. So there's this thing that you definitely talked about earlier on. So this idea of inerrancy, infallibility, like, what do we do with that? If we give that up and they're not the same thing, and I have trouble defining them at any one time and remembering which one is which. So like, I've told you all about a horror story of mine going to a certain church in North Carolina, where they said something along the lines of, we need to get rid of archaic doctrines like the substitutionary atonement. And I famously turned to Jamie and said, man, I could have slept in this morning. So, but like, there were things about the church that I liked and things I didn't like. But one of the things I enjoyed, and I think is something that more traditional, theologically conservative, whatever you want to call it, churches could learn something from, in terms of teaching the Bible to, kids growing up. So they had 66 books on a bookshelf, and they explained that these are all different books. Some of them were written by the same people, but, depending on who you're talking to, we're looking at 40-ish plus authors who wrote all these things over the course of, 2,000-3,000 years. So like, I wonder how much of this, because I know a huge part of my journey of deconstruction was in just being taught basically that the Bible, we can say, of course, it's inspired by God, but thinking of the Bible as written by, like Moses wrote the whole Bible, just thinking of it as this one thing altogether, as opposed to, there might even be beauty in God working through all these different people to weave together this kind of messy narrative that's all strung together with the scarlet thread of Jesus that somehow, gives the story of redemption and a hope for the future, throughout. Like, how much of what you're experiencing right now do you think is tied up in how you've been taught the Bible? Because like I said, it was a huge part for me. It may have been the number one thing for me, in fact, in mine. So just what do you think of that? How much of this is tied up into how you were taught about the Bible and this feeling of, if I give up inerrancy or infallibility, like, what do I even have left?
Yeah, I mean, that's the tough question to answer, right? Because I feel like a lot of people use the phrase, and I almost feel like, I mean, there's a lot of people who are in on Christianity that like take a look at somebody who becomes like a Rob Bell or questions the existence of hell or substitutionary atonement or whatever it is, and says, oh, it's like a slippery slope. You know, you start asking one question, you're just gonna all gonna end up in the same place. And I feel like that's kind of a dismissive way of talking about it, but at the same time, I almost don't think it's entirely wrong, because you start asking questions about inerrancy, and you start asking questions about like infallibility. It starts to like touch on all these other things in the Bible, and that for me is like, what is me letting go of that effect about everything else I've been taught about the Bible? So I'm still figuring out the line between what is something that is just an assumption that I've always been taught about the Bible versus what actually is the Bible. What can I gather from like what's there? And I almost wish I could like go to the Bible with fresh eyes to not see any of the stuff I've ever read into it. And I can't do it. You know, it's impossible to, but I almost wish that I could, because I feel like every time I open it, I'm already reading in, you know, here's why this happened so that this led to this. And like, you know, like this is culturally relative, you know, like what's the line between like what's culturally relative in the Bible versus we're holding on to this for dear life and this is doctrine, you know what I mean? And so I guess to answer your question, I don't know. I think I'm still sorting through a lot of that. And it's not an easy process, because I think for me, like, it's hard for me. I'm still trying to do the work of dissecting, okay, this whole concept, infallibility, inerrancy, does even the Bible say that I have to grip onto that as hard as I can? Or is that something that, because I grew up in a Protestant church and because I gravitated towards Reformed theology growing up, that's what I've carried into my reading of the Bible, you know? And I guess it's hard for me at this stage to sort of figure out what is that line and what am I carrying in myself versus what's actually there.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to be, quite honestly. I mean, for real, you know, I wish more people asked that question.
I wish I could wrap my heart around the fact that it's okay.
Yeah,
you know,
right, absolutely.
Part. It all makes sense in my head. It all makes sense that it's like all this stuff. It's like Bible's full of uncertainty. Like people were uncertain. Authors of the Bible had doubts and questions and problems, you know, and makes sense in my head. It's just trying to connect the head and the heart on that one, I think.
Yeah.
But sorry, were you gonna say?
No, I was gonna ask Sage if he had any more 0.5 questions.
Any other 0.5?
What about any 2.254321 questions?
Well, to be in my defense, I said I had 1.5 questions. I offered what turned out to be 2 questions. So I held up my end of the bargain.
That's pretty good.
I have given you the number of questions that I expected. I've even exceeded the number of questions that I thought I was going to get. So
you've performed.
I think we can move on.
You've checked off all the boxes.
Yes.
Well, I just want to say thank you guys. Thanks for, I mean, honestly, this story is probably, a lot of it is probably new to you. I know there's like bits and pieces of it that some of it we've talked about or hinted about earlier, but I think that it's been helpful to sort of talk this through. And for anyone out there who's listening, I mean, thanks. I don't know how this is supposed to help. I don't know if there's anyone out there who's going through anything similar. In some ways, it just feels like, I mean, how could I possibly be helping anybody sharing this? I feel like all I'm doing is casting more uncertainty on people, and it's not my intent. And I don't want to say all this stuff and like the point of it be, let's make people as comfortable as it could be. But I just want to be honest, you know, I just want to be honest that all this stuff is hitting me in a way that it hasn't before. And to have you listen to that and to be able to express that on this podcast when you know I am like putting effort into writing content for it, you know, and all of that stuff, and being willing to listen and hear me out. Like I can't thank you enough for that. And so thank you. I want to end this with, I do have a quote of the week also, and I saved it for the end. And for me, I don't know, I wasn't even really intending to see this verse, but it sort of caught out of the corner of my eye. And so I just want to end with this bit from 1 Corinthians. It's chapter 13, verse 2. And it's Paul, and he says, if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but have not love, I am nothing. And so for me, I'm not even going to add anything to that. I'm just going to leave it there. Well, today being a very unconventional episode, I would jump into email land, but number one, that would be just tone deaf. Number two,
yeah, have some respect for yourself.
Well, there's nothing disrespectful about email land, but I think we do need to let that one breathe and just sort of end things there. Thank you all for listening, and again, story that's in progress. I'm still sorting through a lot of what it means to me, and you may be in a similar boat trying to figure out what all of it means to you, but you know, you're welcome here, you know, and God, you know, he couldn't possibly be afraid of your questions if he made you, you know. So ask him, and ask him here. This is a safe space for that. And yeah, again, thank you all for listening. And we'll catch you on the next one.